Why you need coding standards for you and your team. Of the teams that I've talked to, maybe 30% have coding standards. It's not like the rest don't have any sort of internal guidelines, they just haven't been codified yet. So instead, these teams are keeping track of their ideas in their head, trying to implement them as they write and review the code. But as a result, they're not consistently being followed. The best practices and consistency have real impact, is a good thing. But what is the actual cost of having inconsistent code throughout your project? Future development is going to be slowed down if you don't have these coding standards. If there are different styles or structures or design patterns used in the code base, then a developer is always going to have to spend extra time to consider which way they should implement new functionality, and they'll have to untangle the logic behind why the same thing is implemented in two different ways when trying to understand the current code. More bugs are going to be introduced if you don't have these coding standards. So using multiple inconsistent approaches is going to significantly increase bugs. It's going to increase risk throughout your project because there's an increased risk that you miss out on covering all of the approaches used when using new functionality. On top of this, it becomes harder to review or create test cases for multiple different approaches used across the project and makes it easier for things to fall through the cracks. It's harder to onboard new team members. One of the biggest hurdles in onboarding a new developer to a project is getting them up to speed in understanding the existing code base. But if the approaches aren't consistent in how that code is structured, then onboarding time is going to be even longer and harder than usual. If it's too complex, onboarding can be almost impossible. So far today, we've used a couple of different terms without fully defining them specifically. And these two terms are best practices and standards. I use these terms, best practices and standards, interchangeably, and I'm referring to any rules you and your team agree should be followed across your code base. A great first step is to use the standards that are widely accepted for your language and framework. The next step is also to establish some rules that are specific to your project and your domain. These aren't mutually exclusive, and you'll want to have both of these styles of rules in your project. Having best practices isn't enough. You need to codify them. As you start to establish best practices and standards you want your team to follow, you need to ensure that they're actually being followed. Ideally, your team is applying these standards while they're writing new code, but you also need to be able to check against them and throughout the development process, especially during code reviews. But this is almost impossible if these code standards aren't clearly codified. Without a readily available outline of how to approach and how not to approach certain situations, your team isn't going to be able to always make sure all of your code is following these standards. By turning them into a living document, you've created a resource that your team can reference throughout the development process to help increase long-term efficiency. So a quick note, I'm not suggesting here that your team mindlessly follow a series of rules that are mandated in a top-down approach. Developing a set of best practices or standards should be a collaborative process from the whole team where you discuss what you want to take and pros and cons to different opinions and different options. These standards also need to be a living document that grows, evolves, and is revisited both as your code base grows and as the underlying technologies or teams you're using change. So why don't teams codify their standards? Given the cost of not having a clear code standard as a team, why do so many engineering teams not have clearly articulated set of best practices? The reasons are: 1, an initial time investment. 2, it does take time to build up an initial set of standards you and your team agree on, but you can start small with just a few standards and agree on these and then build on things from there. Things like auto formatters are a great place to get started because they take out the entire class of inconsistency. And in the long term, the time savings of establishing consistent approaches will outweigh the upfront costs over many times over. Now, sometimes different team members are going to have strong opinions about coding styles and best practices and decisions. The risk of having these debates over approaches can be given some teams pause about discussing and establishing a set of best practices. But settling these disagreements into an agreed upon general approach actually decreases conflict among your team in the long run because it cuts out having this discussion over and over again during code reviews. You can borrow, steal, or build from scratch. It doesn't matter. Thankfully, you don't have to build your entire set of code standards from scratch. There are a number of different types of standards out there and guides or best practices that different companies have published for different languages and frameworks. You can take these as a starting point and add or remove from them as you see fit. You shouldn't feel like you need to adopt everything within an external style guide that you're looking to adopt. Make sure you're only choosing the standards that are relevant to your team. Ideally, you'll want to look and define those rules that are more unique to your projects. Types of guidelines you'll typically look for here, and things around naming standards, packages, libraries, and dependencies are things that you'll want to look for. These are typically the type of things that your team is already focused on during reviews and likely already had discussions about. It's just about formalizing it and codifying it. So turn your best practices into code. Once you have your set of code standards, you need to make sure all of your new code is following them. A common way to do this is to use a combination of linting tools for simple formatting or styling issues along with manual code reviews for the broader standards. But there's a risk with any type of manual code review that issues will fall through the cracks and it takes up more of your team's limited time. So this is the reason why you want to make sure you set up and have codified coding standards for you and your team. It's going to dramatically help you to improve code quality, to improve efficiency, and to overall make your team move faster and to make your project more stable. Make sure we teach a lot of these kind of things, and I give a lot of different business tips. So make sure you check out starterpack.com, subscribe and like the channel so that you can get more of these tips in future videos. Thanks, and we'll check you next time.